The clock above the register ticked past 2 a.m. Andy let out a slow sigh. Leaning against the counter of the dimly lit 7-Eleven, outside the streetlights flickered, their glow barely cutting through the thick, humid air of the late summer night. The storm had been building for hours, the occasional distant rumble of thunder promising a downpour. It was another dead shift, no customers, just the monotonous hum of the coolers and the rhythmic ticking of the clock. Andy ran a hand through his hair and took a sip from a flat soda, his eyes drifting lazily over the security monitors. Empty aisles, empty parking lot. Just the same dull scene he'd seen every night for the past 6 months. Then the noise started. A low, persistent scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. Andy straightened, his heart giving an uncomfortable thud. It was coming from the back, the freezer. He stood still, listening. The sound came again, metal against concrete, slow and deliberate. He swallowed hard and grabbed the store flashlight from under the counter. Probably just a box shifting. Maybe a shelf had collapsed. That's what he told himself as he made his way toward the back of the store. The cold storage door loomed ahead, its surface slick with condensation. Andy hesitated before gripping the handle. He pulled it open and was immediately hit with a wave of icy air. He stepped inside, his breath fogging up in front of him. Nothing looked out of place. The shelves were lined with frozen pizzas, ice cream, and bags of ice, stacked neatly. He shined the flashlight across the room. Everything was still. Then the lights flickered. A sharp ding echoed from the front. Andy's stomach twisted. The register. He turned quickly and exited the freezer, glancing down the aisles. No one was there, but the register had clearly made a sale sound. He hurried back behind the counter and checked the screen. It displayed a total of $6.66. Andy exhaled sharply. Great. Freaky numbers in the middle of the night, just what I needed. His fingers hovered over the keys as he checked the transaction history. There was nothing. No recorded sale, no receipt printed, but the register had definitely made a sound. A loud crack of thunder rattled the store windows. A gust of wind howled outside, sending a stack of newspapers fluttering. The storm was here, and then the lights went out. Complete darkness. Andy stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. He could hear the rain starting to pound against the windows. A few seconds passed, then the lights flickered back on, dimming once, twice, then stabilizing. The security monitors fuzzed with static before coming back to life. Andy's skin prickled. He turned toward the screens, scanning them carefully. The aisles were empty. The parking lot was deserted, but something about the footage felt off. He stared at the freezer camera. The door was open. Andy's stomach turned to ice. He had closed it. He was sure of it. He swallowed hard and glanced toward the back of the store. The freezer door stood slightly ajar, the cold air creeping out in thin wisps. "Nope," he muttered, shaking his head. He wasn't going back there, not for anything. The register dinged again. He whipped around. The screen now showed another random total, $3.33. Andy clenched his fists. This wasn't funny anymore. A burst of static erupted from the store's radio. The old staticky speaker crackled, then a voice whispered through the noise. "Andy!" His blood turned to ice. He stared at the radio. He hadn't touched it all night. The lights flickered violently. The storm raged outside, shaking the glass doors. Andy's breathing came fast and shallow. He grabbed the phone and punched in 911. No dial tone. The scraping sound started again. Andy turned toward the back of the store, dread settling deep in his gut. The noise was growing louder, echoing through the empty aisles. It wasn't a box shifting, it wasn't a shelf collapsing, it was footsteps, slow, dragging. Andy backed up, his hands gripping the counter. He watched the security monitor, his heart hammering. The freezer camera flickered with static again. When it cleared, the door was wide open and something was standing inside. A shadowy figure, unmoving, staring at the camera. No features. Just blackness, like a void in the shape of a person. Andy couldn't breathe. His hands trembled as he stared at the screen, unable to look away. Then, in an instant, the figure was gone. The freezer door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The register dinged again. Andy jumped and spun around. The screen now showed $0. Then everything went silent. The storm outside died down. The rain softened. The store lights returned to normal. Andy stood there for what felt like an eternity before forcing himself to move. He slowly walked to the back, his heart hammering in his ears. The freezer door was closed. He pressed a hand against it. Cold, silent. He exhaled and gave a weak chuckle. Just the freezer acting up. Just a weird power surge. He muttered to himself, his voice shaking. He turned back to the counter, rubbing his temples. Maybe he needed more sleep. Maybe working these graveyard shifts was messing with his head. He let out a slow breath and went back to watching the empty store. Then he saw it. The freezer camera, the footage replayed on a loop, and there, in the frozen aisle just before the static, was himself walking into the freezer. But he never walked out, and the timestamp showed 3:33 a.m. As Andy looked around, the outside cameras caught a glimpse of a shadow lurking out of the parking lot into the darkness of the storm. What was or who was it? Well, never know.